Today, as is the case for most of this year, our gospel reading comes from Mark. The passage that we're going to hear comes from more or less the middle point of the gospel, halfway between the beginning and the end. And I suspect that that's no accident. I'm sure that Mark meant this to be a pivotal point in the story of Jesus, which he unfolds. As we shall hear in this story, Jesus asks his disciples who people, including the disciples themselves, are saying that he is. And various answers are given. Who do you say that Jesus is a question which I quite often pose in sermons. A lot hangs on the answer. Not least, who we say we ourselves are in relation to Jesus, in relation to matters of the faith. If, for example, we were just to answer, well, Jesus was a historical figure, or we were to say he was an influential teacher of his time, or we were to say he was a man about whom other people told stories. And if we were to say no more than that, then that would tell us very little about our own identity in faith. But if we can, like Peter, say that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one of God, however we then go on to define these terms and understand them, then our answer to who we say Jesus is incorporates us into a dangerous idea, into a demanding way of life, into a community of people here and around the world whose values must be radically different from the values of much of the world. Today our gospel reading is paired with a reading from Proverbs. And one of the big themes of the book of Proverbs is the wisdom of God and the idea of God as wisdom. The book highlights the importance of wisdom and of reason and of understanding. And I think these are timely words for us in a society which increasingly shuns these virtues, in which decisions of momentous consequence are made on the basis of misinformation and prejudice and uninformed emotion. Wisdom, reason, and understanding are important in all areas of life, not least in the life of faith. For our faith will have no credibility if it is not built upon them. The country is facing crisis. Westminster is paralysed as Brexiteers do battle with Remainers. Meanwhile, more and more ordinary people are struggling. Businesses are going under. The health service is under greater and greater strain. Ideology, infighting, and ineffectiveness have taken the place of what we probably all feel the country needs. Cool heads, dedicated, selfless service, reasoned decision-making. How long will you simple ones love your simple ways? How long will mockers delight in mockery and fools hate knowledge? The question from the reading from Proverbs that we heard a few minutes ago. It's not just the country, the church is in crisis. A recent survey, you might have seen it in the newspapers, has shown that the percentage of people who identify in any way with the church has dramatically fallen in the last 15 years. Only 4% of 18 to 34-year-olds say they are religious. We're reaching the point at which the Church of Scotland will no longer be financially sustainable. And we waste energy with arguments from which I think no one benefits. We put so much effort into desperately trying to preserve what we once were. Our cooperation with other Christians is too often characterized by timidity. I come back to that question from Proverbs. How long will you simple ones love your simple ways? How long will mockers delight in mockery and fools hate knowledge? In the book of Proverbs, wisdom is both an attribute of God and a manifestation of God, both a characteristic and a character. It's a metaphor, of course, not an explanation. And so we don't need to understand it, but we do need to feel it. We need to experience it. We need to listen. And the warning is stark. If we ignore wisdom, we will experience disaster. And if we go on ignoring wisdom for too long, there will be nothing we can do to get out of the disaster of our own making. It makes you think of climate change, doesn't it? In Proverbs, wisdom is portrayed as being found in relationship with God. And it is in that relationship that knowledge is valued. Those who are unwise hate knowledge. They ignore evidence which doesn't suit them. They despise reason. They will not accept when they have been wrong and seek to change their ways. The wise, on the other hand, prize knowledge and reason and have the grace and the humility to change course if evidence and reason and wisdom guide in that direction. As I said a few minutes ago, our passage from Mark comes from halfway through the Gospel. The first 7 or so chapters have been about observation, about amassing evidence. With Mark, we have, in a sense, been watching Jesus. We've been listening to him. We've heard him teach. We've seen him heal. And we've become more and more aware of the growing tensions between him and the religious authorities of his day. But what Mark has not required us to ask until this point is that question: who do we think Jesus is? Mark tells us that Jesus initiates that conversation with his disciples in a significant place. He and his disciples are going between the villages of Caesarea Philippi. For Jewish people, this was a place on the edge. The name sounds much more Latin or Greek than Hebrew, doesn't it? It was a place of Roman colonial presence on the north edge of Galilee, so a fair bit north from Jerusalem. It was a place really on the border of the Jewish world and the Gentile world. And so it's here that Mark set this story. Here that he has Jesus asking this question, who do people say that I am? Which people is not specified. But let's for a moment assume that that place is significant. If by people Jesus had meant the Jewish religious authorities, then he wouldn't really have needed to ask. It's plain that they thought him dangerous, a heretic, a breaker of the law, a challenger of their authority, a disruptor of the usual order of things. So actually, I think he's asking, who do people around here, in this border place, in this place on the edge, say that I am? Who do these people who are, in a sense, living with one foot in the Jewish world and one in the Roman world and with all its different religious cults, say that I am? Now, the disciples obviously have been talking with local people. They'll have been telling them why they are there around the villages of Caesarea Philippi, telling them about the person they're with, telling them about what Jesus has been saying there and in other places and doing. And the people have been drawing conclusions about the identity of Jesus. They've been reaching back into the knowledge of their religious history to find parallels, to find examples of others, a bit like this person, Jesus, among them at this time. And so they suggest, well, perhaps he's John the Baptist, or maybe he's Elijah, or maybe still one of the other prophets. And these are good guesses. They are all people who spoke God's word. But then Jesus asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? Not the other people. Who do you say that I am? Those closest to Jesus had obviously been discussing this question among themselves, trying to work out really who it was they were with. It's Peter, as so often is the case, who speaks, saying, "You are the Messiah." And immediately, Jesus tells them all not to speak of this to anyone. I would suggest that this may be the reason for that. Peter got the right answer, but the way he thought of the Messiah carried a weight of expectation that Jesus would not bear. To put it another way, he had used the right word, but because of his religious upbringing, his background, his understanding of the scriptures of the Hebrew faith, he had meant something different by it, not what Jesus meant by it. You'll be familiar with the fact that Messiah in traditional Jewish thinking had to do with strength and deliverance, about purifying Israelite society, about driving out oppressors and ushering in a new era of peace and supremacy for the nation of Israel. But you know too that Jesus' thoughts about this kind of messiahship were quite different. To him, being the anointed one of God, that's what Messiah means, was about revealing the loving nature of God in suffering and in death. about God entering the fullness of humanity and humanity entering the fullness of God. Had the disciples in a politically tense place like Caesarea Philippi gone out and started telling people the Messiah is here, potentially catastrophe could have ensued. It was about having the wisdom to deal appropriately with the knowledge. Having spoken this identification of Jesus, he began to teach his disciples about what following him would mean from now on. He told them that they had to deny themselves and take up their cross. We've tended to give these phrases a rather trite interpretation, making denying oneself no more than delaying gratification, and taking up one's cross no more than putting up with things without complaint. But I don't think that's really what Jesus was talking about. Denying oneself was actually a question about identity. In a culture which identified who you were by what your family ties were, the call to deny oneself was a call to say, do not identify me by who my mother and father are or who my sisters and brothers are, but identify me by who I am now with. Identify me as a follower of Christ and as a member of the community of those who follow him. And taking up one's cross was not about embracing suffering as if suffering was somehow necessary to validate faith. But it's about embracing a life of witness and service. Losing one's life, except in the most extreme circumstances, in this context is about giving up worldly expectations or ambitions and finding true meaning in life lived in obedience to God's will. There is something scandalous about this passage, especially so if one reads it carelessly, without reason, without understanding. If you take it too much at face value, it makes Jesus look like some crazy cult leader glorying in suffering and leading his disciples into suffering. But if we approach it through the prisms of reason and understanding, we see that that cannot be what he meant. Jesus didn't fetishize suffering. We've just had 7 chapters in the Gospel of Mark showing him alleviating suffering, caring for those who were ill, standing up to those who were oppressive. We see too the results of reasoning in the disciples, in how they figured out who Jesus was, even if it took them a bit longer to understand it more fully. We see in both these passages the necessity of approaching matters of faith critically and with intelligence. Without knowledge, we cannot hope to explain. Without understanding, we cannot hope to convince. And the wise use of knowledge will mean knowing not only what we do know, but what we don't know. knowing, in other words, where the limits of our knowledge and understanding lie. When Jesus found that his disciples had worked out that he was the Messiah, he stopped them telling people until they understood properly what that meant, not what they thought it meant. And that's a reminder to us not to try to make claims which go beyond what we can know. As Jesus had this conversation about his identity and, by extension, his disciples' identity in a place on the margins of the Jewish world, that idea of the margins, I think, highlights where so much of our ministry must take place. Among those who are on the edge of faith, among those who are questioning, those who are not sure. Nothing will put people off encountering Christ more than if we present him in a way that reason will reject, or if indeed we misrepresent him entirely, something Jesus warned his disciples not to do. Our call, as often as not, is to be with others in the place of uncertainty, recognizing that that must be a place for faithful people too. To be with others in the place of questioning, honestly acknowledging the questions we have too, and not falling into the temptation to try to provide answers, any answers, which may or may not be right. If we are to be disciples of Christ, we must be questioners too. We must be learners. We must be people who seek after the wisdom of God. Thanks be to God. Amen.